Hi everybody, this is April. Welcome back to the second episode of Just an April Zephyr. I'm at my church right now. My husband runs the sound here, and there's choir practice going on in the room next door. So I figured as long as I was here, I would go ahead and maybe do a vlog here. My husband and I, we attend Heritage Baptist Church in Ashburn, Virginia. The pastor here is named David Barton. He and his lovely wife Ellie are probably the best pastors and pastor's wife I've ever had. So it's really, really nice to have people leading us who I really enjoy and respect and who's such a great teacher. It's kind of funny. Of course, I've grown up in the church. I grew up as a Southern Baptist. This is an independent Baptist, a major big difference. But I grew up a Southern Baptist, and I was raised by my grandparents. So they had us into the church whenever the doors were open. And so my grandfather was a head deacon, and he actually probably holds the record at Samoset First Baptist Church for being chairman of the deacons the most time. So we were raised by them, which meant that we were in church whenever the doors were open, like I said. Granddaddy insisted that we wear dresses. Lord help him, because I grew up in the 70s, 60s and 70s, and in the 70s came the mini skirt. Yeah, he wasn't happy about that. But, you know, that style, it changes all the time. As a teenager, I didn't mind it so much, but I admit I was a little uncomfortable with how short skirts were. So I wasn't always in fashion. But, you know, growing up there with my grandparents was the best thing that could have happened to my sister and me. When my parents divorced, my sister was, I think, 8 or 9, and I was either 10 or 11. And the judge awarded us to our grandparents, our paternal grandparents. And my grandparents, Woody and Bee, were the best thing that could have ever have happened to us. They weren't rich, and they were barely middle class. But we got by. Granddaddy worked as a mechanic specializing in carburetors. He worked at Guarantee Electric down in Bradenton, and he worked hard. He brought home usually $100 a week from there. And so on the side, he would go to places like Cortez, where they have the fishing boats. And when there was something wrong with the engines, he would go out there and he would fix the engines. Usually he did the work for the Bell Fish Company and Starfish Company. As far as I know, Bell Fish Company is still there. So he would work on their engines, and as payment, they would pay him with sacks of fish or shrimp. So he would come home sometimes with 1 or 2 big trash bags just full of fish or shrimp. And that was pretty good. We were able to put away a lot of stuff and freeze it, and so we never were out of fish or shrimp. It was a pretty good thing. He would work out there, and sometimes he would come home late at night. And I remember one time, I think that this happened though when he was at the shop, he accidentally poked a hole, got a puncture in his hand, and he was working with a high pressure air hose and accidentally hit that hole in his hand with that air hole, and it blew his hand up about 3 times bigger than it should be. It was pretty bad. But there was another time, I don't use bad language, and really neither did Granddaddy. But this one time he was working, and this man came in and he's swearing up and down, I can't get my GED car to work. My GED car just won't start. It's awful. I can't stand this. It's got to get fixed. And Granddaddy had opened up the hood, and the man just kept going, this GED car. Well, Granddaddy looked at the man, and he smiled his sweet smile, and he said, well, mister, there's nothing I can do. And the man said, what do you mean there's nothing you can do? And Granddaddy said, if God's damned the car, there's nothing I can do. And he closed the hood and walked away, and the man stood there with his mouth hanging open. It's one of my favorite stories of Granddaddy's. He and Ma, they lived in a little house that was built special for them. Our old neighbors, the Lances, it used to be their property. And they decided to build the house for Ma and Granddaddy right next to theirs. And it was on a dead-end street, right next to the railroad tracks. And eventually, they would build my high school across the street. When Ma and Granddaddy first moved there, it was a sheep farm. And my grandmother would tell us stories about here during the spring. She'd be able to look out across where the pasture was, where all the sheep was, and you could see the farmer's lantern going from sheep to sheep as they were giving birth. I always enjoyed that story. It's a shame things can't be more like that. But Ma and Granddaddy, they did a good job raising us. They had 2 super-sized gardens. We only had half an acre, but we had the 2 super-sized gardens that they grew. They were fantastic farmers. They grew the best vegetables. So we had that, and we also had a flock of chickens. We had Rhode Island Reds. Granddaddy would go to the livestock store over in Parrish and pick up a bunch of eggs, and my grandmother would incubate them using an old hairdryer and a box. And she would hatch out the eggs, and we couldn't wait for the chickens to hatch. They were just so cute, so tiny, going cheep, cheep, cheep. And we had this toy poodle named Mickey. Mickey loved the chicks. All we'd have to do is cup our hands and say, chick, chick, Mick, and Mickey would come running to see the chickens. We had the Rhode Island Reds, and we had their pen out in the backyard, out in the far backyard, beside the banana tree. So they had plenty of shade in that hot Florida sun. And later on, when my sister and I were probably in our early teens, we would walk to church, and all we had to do was walk across the railroad tracks, turn left, and walk for a block, and there was our church. One day we were walking to Sunday school, and we heard a rustling before we got to the railroad tracks. So I went over to look, and what did I find? I found a baby pig. I found a piglet in the weeds that had fallen off a truck. There was nothing wrong with it. My sister went back and got my grandfather, and he came, and we caught the piglet, and we ended up raising her. Named her Harriet, I think. No, Maxine. Her name was Maxine. She turned out to have some really good pork chops and ham and bacon and fatback, and yeah, it was nice having a pig. Well, later on, after Maxine was gone and after the hens were gone, Ma and Granddaddy got me a horse. I was a horse crazy girl. I had toy horses and horse posters, and I even had a pretend horse in the backyard that I would take care of. It stayed underneath the parson orange tree right next to the pool that my grandmother dug us. And I would take care of that pretend horse, feeding it in the mornings and in the afternoons and grooming it. And I remember going to the dump one time with Granddaddy, and we found a child's used saddle and a bridle and a bunch of bits. And he actually let me bring those back from the dump. And then he tried to build me a paper mache horse. And I was able to put my saddle and the bridle and everything on that horse. And I played with that thing and played with that thing. And I loved it. I loved it. And so it never did get finished. It was the wood base with chicken wire around it, stuffed with trash bags. But it was sturdy enough for me to sit on and to pretend that I was riding it. And it worked a whole lot better than that tree limb that I used to pretend was my horse. So eventually I got a horse of my own, and I joined the Manatee County Sheriff's Junior Mounted Posse. And I started doing barrel racing and racing flags and doing pole bending and all that fun Western speed stuff. I loved it. I worked for this lady. her adult daughter, who took care of the horses, was going to be having a baby. And so they needed someone to take care of the horses for her. I would go out on Friday nights. She would pick me up on Friday nights. We would go to Publix and buy snacks for overnight and do a grocery shopping. Then we would go back to their place, and her name was Jenny Scott, and Jenny and I would sit there and we would watch movies and TV and until the early hours, and then I would spend the night, and then about 6 or 7 in the morning I would get up. We'd feed the horses, I would clean the stalls, groom the horses. If they needed shots, I would give them shots, and I would take them out and turn them loose into the pastures. It was a great job. I loved it. The only part I didn't like was after I finished with the horses and the barn, I had to go in and clean up her house. Yeah, I was 13. I've never been a housekeeper. I figure if God wanted me to keep house, I would have been born with a broom in my hand. No broom. So they had a couple of German Shepherds, so there was a lot of dog hair. That's okay, I like dogs. Right up until the time when one bites you. Yeah. One of them bit me one time. We were at the Easter camp out at the arena, and one of the dogs got her paw stuck in her leash. And so I went over and I'm trying to get the paw unstuck from the leash, and she bit me. Bit me on the arm. I still have a scar. And when Cricket, Jenny's daughter, found out about it, she was there too with her husband. She had to drive me into the hospital, to the emergency room, to get my tetanus shot and to get it cleaned up. It wasn't that bad of a bite, but it left a scar. But I'm not afraid of dogs, even after being bitten by the German Shepherd. When I was 5, I was attacked by my aunt's collie, and I ended up with a really bad scar under my eye. When they were trying to put the stitches in at the hospital, you could hear me screaming all the way out to the parking lot where my grandfather and my sister was. So I now have company. His name is AJ, and he's one of the youth here at our church. And so he's in the kitchen looking for something to drink or something to chew on. So anyway, back to where I was. I was attacked by that collie when I was 5. I patted her on the rear end when she was eating her food. Big mistake. So I ended up with a rather glorious scar under my eye. And then I never was afraid of dogs. I like dogs. I was more of a dog person than a cat person. But growing up with my grandparents, we weren't really allowed to have dog. And cats, they were outside pets. At one point, we did have a hamster. We had a little brown and white teddy bear hamster. Hamster got loose, got outside. 3 years later, we found it floating dead in the swimming pool. It survived for 3 years outside in our yard. That's pretty good. I mean, the lifespan of a hamster is about 3 years, so that's about right. And so our pool that was in the backyard, my grandmother actually dug it and made it herself. It used to be where they used to burn their trash in the backyard. And she decided, you know what? My grandkids need a swimming pool. Keep them out of my hair during the summer. So she dug it out by herself. The deep end was about 3 feet, and it curved upward to the steps. There were 3 steps. And she got it dug out, and then she had the concrete guy come, and they poured the concrete and set the walls. And Mom made the patio. She got her own concrete and made her own patio for us. And then she painted the pool and bought herself a little, whatever that machine's called that takes care of cleaning the pool. And she was the pool man, and she took care of the pool. And my sister and I loved it. We were in that pool all the time. Now, our friends from Sunday school would come over, and they would play in the pool too. And it was so funny. I mean, here we are, these 12 and 13-year-old girls in this teeny tiny little pool. And we thought it was fantastic. until we got to be about, 16, and we were allowed to go to the beach. And we would go to the beach with our friends. We spent a lot of weekends at the beach. It was pretty good. We grew up only about 10 miles from the beach. And so we would drive out with our friends out to Anna Maria Island, and we would hang out there, and it was a lot of fun. And so if you ever get a chance to go down to Bradenton, go out to Anna Maria Island. Go out, drive out there on Manatee Avenue. When you get to the end of Manatee Avenue there on the island, turn left. Follow the road all the way to St. Armand's Key in Sarasota. It's a great drive. You'll probably enjoy it. Anyway, growing up with my grandparents, we learned a lot. My sister took up baton lessons. She was really, really good. My grandmother made all of her costumes for doing the baton competitions, and she did really great. She was a very good baton twirler. I rode the horse. She did the baton. Eventually, she became a baton twirler at our high school, and then she decided to slack off and try something different. So she ended up being one of the people who do the rifles. You know how they twirl the rifles? She ended up one of those. And so I met my husband in high school. It was really fun meeting him. I gotta tell you about how we met. You see, when we were juniors in 11th grade there at the school, it was time for prom. Now, my husband was in one of my classes, a couple of my classes, and I thought he was okay. I mean, he was all right. He was this really skinny guy with brown hair and a perm and gorgeous blue eyes. But he wasn't my type. The guy I wanted to take me to the prom, nope, he never did ask me. I didn't find out why until after graduation. But anyway, he was a great guy. I liked him. We're still friends. I ended up going to the prom with Steve for our junior prom, my future husband. We double dated with some friends of ours, Jean and Lisa. Went out to this restaurant out toward the island called the Seven Seas. Very ritzy restaurant, had filet mignon. It was such a nice place. And then we drove down to where the prom was being held. I wasn't too happy being there with Steve. And being a good Southern Baptist girl, of course I didn't dance. I just sat at the table and he sat with me. And we watched the other kids dance and build their pyramid out of champagne glasses. And yeah, it was kind of a boring date, especially for Steve. But you know what? He finally took me home. I wouldn't let him kiss me at the door. I pretended I was catching a cold. Bad girl. Oh, it was so bad. I was mean to that boy. The next morning was Sunday. Now, Steve doesn't go to church. At least he didn't go to church back then. We go to church. I sit down in a chair in our Sunday school room in the youth group. And who walks in the door? Steve. What does he do? He walks over and sits right next to me. Please. So I got up, went across the room and sat between two friends. Luckily, there were some boys there who kind of knew Steve and took pity on him, went and sat with him. They became very good friends. Well, after Sunday school was over, I jumped up and go running over to the sanctuary to get into our family pew. We didn't have assigned pews, but my family always sat on the left side, fourth pew from the front, one of the short pews. I would sit next to the wall. My sister would file in, sit next to me, and then my grandmother, and then my grandfather on the end. Well, we did that. And who should come in? Steve, my future husband. Went right past their knees and sat down next to me, between me and my sister. Yeah. I got up, walked out, and I walked home. It was the first time in my life that I ever got up and walked out of a church service. My grandparents were astounded. And when they got home after church, I heard, "Why are you being so mean to that nice boy?" Well, I married him. we've been married for 37 years, and marrying him was the best thing I could have done. He has been a fantastic husband. He is loving. He's smart. Oh my goodness, he's smart. We've had our daughters, and at some point we lived in Canada for 3 years because he was originally from Canada, and we moved back to Florida, and now we live in Virginia, Northern Virginia, which is a state unto itself if you listen to everybody. But we love it, and he is a fantastic husband. I honestly feel like God gave him to me as a gift because he has been a gift, and I absolutely love being married to him. It was really funny. When we got engaged, we were pretty young. We were both 17 when we got engaged. And when we got married, he was 18 and I had just turned 19. And we got married at our church, and it was a homemade wedding. I bought my wedding gown from my ex-boyfriend's new wife for about $75. Nice dress, I still have it. And my grandmother made the gown for my bridesmaid, Angie, and she and my sister and I made the little finger sandwiches to eat, and then my grandmother made the cake. It was a cute little cake. It was white with roses on it. Ma was really good at decorating cakes. So Steve got to the church with his best man, Malcolm, who used to be an old boyfriend of mine, and they couldn't find the steps going up to the stage. See, we had these steps that you would fit in that went at the middle of the stage for people who were getting married to go up and down on. They couldn't find it. They weren't there. They looked and looked and looked, and finally, about 15 minutes before the wedding was supposed to happen, they finally found it. So everybody's sitting there in the sanctuary. I'm in the bride's room finishing up primping, and Steve and Malcolm go walking down the aisle with the steps on their shoulders. It was pretty good. Our pastor who was marrying us, Bob Franklin, we were his first wedding. He was standing outside the door with Steve after that, waiting for them to go in for the wedding. And we had the soloist singing Follow Me by John Denver. And she had changed a few of the words. And I remember 3 weeks before the wedding, the pastor had said, if you have that song in your wedding, I won't perform the wedding. Well, they're standing at the door. Susie is singing the song. Pastor turns to Steve and says, "That's a beautiful song. What song is that?" And Steve looked at him and said, "Follow Me by John Denver." He said the look on the pastor's face was priceless. The pastor didn't like John Denver. He was a humanist. So Steve and I happened to love John Denver. So we got married, went to SeaWorld for our honeymoon, and came home. And like I said, we've been together ever since. I love my husband. So anyway, this is kind of long. We're running into about 25 minutes now, and I figure that's long enough. So thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please come back. Make sure you subscribe and touch the bell there so that you'll be able to get any updates. Thank you so much for watching. This is April. See you later.